Hi, everyone. I want to take a minute today and just differentiate a little bit between effigism and narcissism. Everyone hears about narcissism all the time. It's like, he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist, and I grew up in a narcissistic family, and that's just become a bit of a buzzword. But the reality is that not everybody who we accuse of being a narcissist may actually be a narcissist. In fact, some of them may be effigists. And this is a new term that I think is important to understand, because when we look at what the experience is like for a kid growing up in a home with a narcissist versus an effigist, those two experiences are pretty different. And also in a relationship, if you are in a marriage with someone who is an effigist versus a narcissist, that experience is going to be pretty different and will affect you in different ways. And since there really hasn't been any conversation at all about effigism, I want to take just a few minutes today and talk about how those two experiences are different, because they are different. If we back up just for a minute and look at what the difference between narcissism and effigism is, just so we can understand what we're talking about here. With narcissism, the narcissist is someone who has a very fragile sense of self, lacks the ability to really be aware of what is going on in here, and carries with them a really deep wound around being seen or having a sense of value. And so what they do is, instead of being able to look inwards and go, God, I have a low sense of self, I have a low self-esteem, I feel unheard, I feel invisible. Instead, what they do, because they lack that ability, is they kind of project that outward, and they try to recruit other people as kind of proxies for themselves to mirror back to them admiration, you're so amazing, all of this kind of stuff, as a way of kind of stabilizing that fragile sense of self. And in so doing, because everything has to be oriented around the narcissist, everyone else around them is deprived of having their own needs met. And in fact, oftentimes they have to actively just, shut down or ignore, or they learn to try to dissociate from their own needs for a sense of feeling heard, of feeling important, of someone attending to them, because it's always about attending to the narcissist, right? And so when somebody is in that narcissistic family and they're like, you know what? This is not okay, because it's like everything is about them, and what about me? And so when somebody in that family system tries to set a boundary and just said, you know what, I need to be seen too. I need to feel valued. I have needs too, just like everybody else. And it is not fair for all of us just to be orienting completely around managing the emotional life of the narcissist in the center. And when you do that, everybody goes, oh my God, how dare you? Don't you know how much he needs us or she needs us or whatever? And so there's oftentimes backlash when people set some boundaries, or when they back away from the narcissist, because the narcissist needs them in order to manage their own emotional well-being. Now, an effigist is different, and that difference is pretty significant and has a very different effect on the people around them. So in an effigist, they don't need somebody to just kind of mirror back to them their awesomeness. What they need to do is they need to have somebody They need to create a failed space. They need to put someone in a failed state as a way of stabilizing and elevating their sense of self by contrast, right? So it's like, you're the sick one, you're the wrong one, you're the bad one, you're the defective one, because they're unable to recognize all of that inside of themselves. And an effigist, most of the time, grew up in a family where they were humiliated and mocked and not just shamed, but viciously shamed, where they may have been trotted in front of other people and openly mocked as a way of just assassinating their character. And in narcissism, narcissists can come from a lot of different places, but oftentimes there's more of a neglect element, or there may have been, more of kind of an emotional insensitivity or cruelty or something like that. But the difference is that in an effigist, oftentimes they carry with them this deep sense of humiliation, where they feel incompetent, they feel humiliated, they have this internalized sense of just like, not only am I unseen, not only am I inadequate, not only am I do I have a low sense of value, but it's that the being exposed and humiliated was the injury and is so terrifying to happen that any time that you try to push back on an effigist and you question particularly their competence or whether something is right or whether they are wrong, you can almost see this wave of defensiveness and this wave of anger that comes out, because the injury that they need to protect is this humiliation of being discovered, right? Of the humiliation of being seen. In the effigist, there is such a profound undermining of the sense of self. And like a narcissist, they do not have the ability to inwardly reflect on that and be aware of that. And it was just a defensive mechanism that their brain put up to try to navigate through life while carrying this extremely deep wound. And so the experience of growing up with an effigist is that an effigist will tend to constantly belittle and mock and shame, and not just shame like you're bad, but it's like nobody will ever think anything of you. You are just the biggest loser ever. You are less worthy than a freaking barn cat. That is how low of a life form you are. And even though those particular words may not come out, through their actions, what an effigist does is it's a constant death by 1,000 cuts to undermine and place oftentimes a child or a partner in this failed state. And in kids who grow up in homes like that, oftentimes there's just like no sense of identity, no sense of who am I? I can't seem to do anything right. Any decision I make is the wrong one. And it's like anything that I do, I get mocked for, even things that would normally be celebrated by a parent. And and that's the home I grew up in, right? And there were a couple of times in my life that I can remember when, I had told my father, like, I plan to go to medical school, or I'm going to go into, data science or computer science, and a couple of these different things. And it didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter what it was. that came with a hostile attack. And, even though, most parents, if a kid was going to go to medical school, they'd be like, yay, what can we do to support you? Good for you. You can do it, right? But in an effigistic system, what that represents to the effigist is that proxy moving out of a failed state, right? And that effigist needs that proxy in that failed state to try to help elevate their own sense of self, their fragile sense of self, by contrast, where they can say, look at how much better I am. And the reality is that much of what they are doing is that they are offloading a lot of their own woundedness and the things that they heard and the messages that they received and the injuries that they had during their own childhood. They're offloading those onto their child or onto a partner. And things like this can also happen, believe it or not, even in the workplace when you have somebody who is a subordinate, right? An effigist, one of the expressions that can happen, it doesn't always, but one of the the ways that this can express itself is having a subordinate at work where you're like, the effigist won't give them the information they need, or will do things to try to undermine their own success and their own status, so that the effigist is not exposed as being the one who's incompetent. Because that exposure, that humiliating exposure of incompetence, is so deeply terrifying for an effigist that they have to, in order to protect themselves, they have to project that onto another and keep someone in a failed state. And that's a little bit different than narcissism, right? In narcissism, as long as you're playing the game and you're like, boy, howdy, you're the most amazing person ever in the history of anything, that the narcissist will be like, yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, we're all good. And it's like we can all be one big happy family, all just paying attention to me, right? And it's different with effigism because the effigist needs someone in that failed state. Someone coming out of an effigistic home will oftentimes enter into adulthood in a pretty broken state. You tend to see a lot of addiction. You tend to see a lot of just kind of like failure at things. It's like they kind of fail to really differentiate themselves well. They tend to fail at like finding a career path, or it's really inconsistent and it seems to fly from one place to another. And a lot of that is that the framework of the self that is normally developed when parents are engaged in a positive way and they're with their children while their children are developing, that internal framework of the self is not only doesn't develop well because of deprivation like you would see in a narcissistic system, it is actually undermined but in an effigistic system. And so oftentimes these kids come into adulthood and they're just like, man, I feel disoriented. I don't feel like I know what to do. There, a lot of people who end up in prison, and really in a lot of trouble, come from homes where there was this sort of intentional cruelty from an effigistic parent toward them, if not downright sadism. And this is, it's different from sadism, right? Sadism itself, when you're cruel, you get some sense of pleasure by seeing other people suffer. And, with somebody who is a sadist, it's like, it almost doesn't matter who it is. It could be anybody. It could be a dog. It could be a cat. I mean, it could be anything that watching them suffer somehow brings you pleasure. But with an effigistic parent, it's different because, or I should say partner as well. In an effigistic system, it is not just that they take pleasure out of putting a child or a partner into a failed state. It's that they need that in order to stabilize and elevate a very broken sense of self. And so that difference is very important to understand. And if you grew up in an effigistic home, you may really struggle with a lot of stuff. I know I certainly did. And, a lot of people who I know who come out of homes that are like that, many of them die early. Many of them end up in prison. They're, into addiction, into crime. Not all of them end up in crime and addiction and all of that, but many do. Addiction is very, very common. And even those who, are able to achieve some modicum of success, oftentimes just carry this deep sense of, kind of like, I don't really know who I am. I'm kind of going through the motions, right? I'm doing the things, to make the house payment, to keep the job, to do all of that kind of stuff. But there's still this just kind of sense of real brokenness that I carry inside of me. And that is just super, super painful. It can be catastrophic to somebody who grew up in a family system like that. And even in relationships, when you have a partner who is an effigist, you can tell the difference between an effigist and a narcissist by whether it feels like they need to keep you feeling stupid and humiliate you and keep you in a failed state in order for them to feel better. It's almost like when you are in collapse, then it's like, they feel better. It's a real phenomenon that I hate to use the word crazy, but it is. It's a crazy deal, but it's a real phenomenon. And it can be incredibly damaging to the sense of self. So I just want to take a minute, just throw this out there, just to differentiate narcissism from effigism. Effigism is a new term that I created to describe my experience growing up, because none of the other labels really fit. Wasn't really a narcissistic thing, even though there were kind of some elements of that. It wasn't really that there was just emotional neglect, even though there were some things like that. There was more of an active undermining of the self, and that really just hadn't been described anywhere else. And that's why, I just wrote a paper and submitted it for publication. But I think this idea of effigism is a real deal, and you'll be hearing more about it. So I hope you found this helpful. I look forward to seeing you again. Oh, be sure to subscribe, please. Talk to you soon.